everyone. My name is Robin, and welcome to my channel, The Prophetic Engineer, where we talk about how to know and live by God's design for your life. It has been a while, and I think it's been a year since my last video, but I am back now. And today we're going to talk about thinking big. So, what is thinking big? Thinking big means believing in God's limitless power and aligning your thoughts with his possibilities and not your limitations. It's about seeing beyond your current circumstances and trusting that God can do immeasurably more than all we ask or imagine. And this is important because we are coming out of a season where I believe there was a lot of resistance and pushback to move forward in the things that God has told us to do. And maybe for the body has created some weariness, some doubt, some disappointments, and changing the way, shifting the way we initially probably thought about it and shifting to a perspective of more, it's not going to happen or it may not happen. And I think the thinking big in this time and season is what we need to kind of push us and project us into everything that God has. Because if God says it, it's going to happen. And so seeing it from his vantage point, seeing that he has limitless power and aligning with our thoughts with his possibilities, right? And so in that, we can prosper in everything that God has called us to do. So since we're looking at it from God's vantage point, we're able to partner with everything he has called us to do. And we're looking at it from a viewpoint of, yes, I had setbacks. Yes, this didn't happen in the past, but I can see what God is seeing, right? I know what God is saying and looking at it from that perspective. And he's a God that can do anything. He's the God of the impossible and looking at it from that perspective. So, how do we start to think big? So, really, the first step is lining with God's vision. What has God said? Let's look at Psalm 139, starting in verse 15. It says, "My frame was not hidden from you when I was being made in secret, intricately woven in the depths of the earth. Your eyes saw my unformed substance, and in your book were written every one of them, the days that were formed for me, when as yet there was none of them. How precious to me are your thoughts, O God. How vast is the sum of them. If I would count them, they are more than the sand." And in this, the psalmist is saying, you had a plan written for me in my book, even before I was born. So you had plans, you had a vision for me. And in order to know that, we can just ask God, what is the vision you have for me? Show me a few pages out of that book, right? And even for me lately, I've been just focusing on what is your vision for the quarter? So at the beginning of each quarter, what is the vision for the quarter? What do you have for me? And then it talks about in that passage how his thoughts are as vast as the sand on the seashore. God has so many thoughts about us that we're just asking, Lord, what are the thoughts that you have about us, about our identity, about what we were supposed to do? Again, the first thing to do is ask God for the vision. So I understand that some of you may be in different levels of hearing from God and tuning your ear to being in tune with hearing from God. And even if you're unsure, if you ask him for confirmation, he'll confirm it for you. He might send someone to give you a prophetic word. You might see something and you're like, oh, I believe this is the answer to what God is saying. Or, oh, I believe this is confirming. I'm also going to do videos on this to kind of help those who aren't as in tune to hearing God's voice to start tuning their ear to hear his voice. The next one is believing, coming into an agreement with what God has said in his vision. So this is very important. And as I mentioned before, when coming out of the season where it just seems like things weren't moving, like really standing firm and believing what God has said. And we see a good example of this in Numbers 13. And in this passage, this is where Moses sent 12 spies to the promised land before they were going to take the promised land. And in this, we see them coming back with their reports. And in verse 27, it says, "And they told him, we came to the land which you sent us. It flows with milk and honey, and this is its fruit. However, the people who dwell in the land are strong, and the cities are fortified, very large. And besides, we saw the descendants of Anak there. The Amalekites dwell in the land of the Negev, the Hittites, the Jebusites, and the Amorites dwell in the hill country, and the Canaanites dwell by the sea and along the Jordan. But Caleb quieted the people before Moses and said, "Let us go up at once and occupy it, for we are able to overcome it." So this is the land that God said that is the promised land and that they shall have. And so you see here, Caleb truly believed this, even though when they went to spy it out, they saw giants. They saw all their enemies encamped around the land. Caleb was like, nope, we can still occupy this. We got this. And we see in the story where it was Caleb and Joshua who actually like still believed and had good reports. However, there were 10 of the other representatives, they had bad reports. And what happened was they gave their bad report, they incited fear, and the Israelites started complaining about going into the promised land and complaining about their situation. And that is when God said that they will not enter the promised land. We see just the importance, even though it looks bad, even though it looks like there's giants and oppositions, of still believing in what God has said, right? Because he's looking at it from a totally different perspective. Like, these giants are nothing. This is what I said. This is what's going to happen. And I can do the impossible. And so the third one is speaking life and possibility. The scripture example here is in Joshua 6. So again, Joshua was the individuals who spied out the first time. They didn't enter the promised land. When Moses died, he became the leader, and God was giving them another opportunity to go into the promised land. And in this, they're about to conquer Jericho. And God had already told Joshua the strategy as far as you're going to go and you're going to march around the city for 7 days, and the seventh day you're going to conquer it. In Joshua 6, it says, on the seventh day, they rose early at the dawn of the day and marched around the city in the same manner 7 times. It was only on that day that they marched around the city 7 times. And at the seventh time, when the priests had blown the trumpets, Joshua said to the people, "Shout, for the Lord has given us this city." So Joshua is speaking life into their situation. And you have to think about this because Joshua, again, was part of that group that did not make it in the first time. So this is like his second attempt. And so I'm sure there was this, okay, we didn't get it the first time. Are we sure? Are we definite? And in the beginning, in Joshua 1, we see that God tells Joshua multiple times, be strong and courageous. So I question sometimes, like, was he kind of going back and forth because he was on the verge of entering the promised land and then it didn't happen because other people didn't believe. But in this, still trusting God, and he's speaking life. We are going to take this city today. God is going to give this to us today. And so I think that's very important, that to decree and declare the things that God has said, even though you may have come up to it, it didn't happen and missed it, continue to decree and declare. The next one is actually stepping out. So stepping out into God's vision, he's going to give you the timing. He's going to set you up for the right situation and position you. And when it's time to actually step. And a good example of this is David. And in 1 Samuel chapter 17, we see that David had went to the camp where his brothers were. And when he was at the camp, he saw that the Israel army was being taunted by the giant Goliath. David said, okay, well, I will fight Goliath. 1 Samuel 17, chapter 37, and David said, the Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine. And Saul said to David, go, and the Lord be with you. Then Saul clothed David with his armor. He put a helmet of bronze on his head and clothed him with a coat of mail, which is body armor. And David strapped his sword over his armor. And he tried in vain to go, but he had not tested them. Then David said to Saul, I cannot go with these, for I have not tested them. So David put them off. Then he took his staff in his hand and chose 5 smooth stones from the brook and put them in the shepherd's pouch. His sling was in his hand, and he approached the Philistines. So there are a couple things I want to point out here. And the first one is, when it's time to step out, know that God has already prepared you. Because if you see, David said, I fought a lion, I fought a bear. I am ready for this. God is going to deliver me from this. And so God had already prepared him to fight and to be a warrior. And just a background, by this time, David had already been anointed as the next king of Israel. And in that time period, kings were warriors. And so he knew that God had prepared him for what he had called him into. And this makes me think about a personal story of mine. When I was in college, I went for a officer position in one of the organizations on campus. And I had to stand up in front of people and just tell why I wanted the position and tell things about me and why I'm good for the position. And I remember when I stood up, my voice was shaking. It was just shaking. So much to the point, my friends started making fun of me. And like years later, she's like, yeah, I remember when your voice was shaking. And then a couple years later, I went for a position on the regional board. And the position on the regional board was a position where I had to stand up in front of at least 200 people every time we had a regional meeting. And so I started to get comfortable with the regional meetings. And as you know, my background's in engineering. I worked in manufacturing plants coming out of college. So one day, my manager tells me how they're rolling out this new production system at our company and that they had a position for me to go out and help roll out to the different plant sites. And that required me, one, traveling every single week in North America, so Canada and the US, and doing presentations every week. It got to the point where for months we were doing it every week, and then we did it 3 weeks out of the month. For that, I got so much experience in presenting and talking. And when I look at some of the words that God has said over my life about speaking and things of that nature, I look and I see, man, He has prepared me for this. I have an engineering degree and I was doing like presentations and stuff. So when I look at that, I'm like, God really was setting things in place. And even though it seems like, oh, well, this is totally different than what I went to school for, he had already started putting things in place to prepare me for what he has eventually called me to. And the other thing is, you don't have to be like everyone else. So step out in how you know God has prepared you to step out. So if we look at this story, Saul was giving David his armor, and David put it on. And he's like, this is not tested. I haven't tested this out. Give me that slingshot, give me those rocks, and let me just go and do what God has trained me to do and how he trained me to do it. We don't have to do it like everyone else do it. We don't have to come in thinking that we have to be like others. We can just be how God created us to be and be how he trained us to be and to use the tools that he's given us to use. That's how you think big. So let's talk about what can be holding you back. And so the first thing that be holding you back from thinking big is not understanding your identity and your identity as sons and daughters of God. And I think this is very important. And we see in Galatians 4, where Paul is talking to the Galatians, and he says, I mean that the heir, as long as he is a child, is no different from a slave, though he is the owner of everything, but he is under guardians and managers until the date set by his father. In the same way, we also, when we were children, were enslaved to the elementary principles of the world. But when the fullness of time had come, God sent forth his son, born of woman, born under the law, to redeem those who were under the law, are no longer a slave, but a son. And if a son, then an heir through God. So it is important to know that we are heirs of God. And when we think about an heir is somebody who receives the promised inheritance from the person they're an heir to, right? So a lot of times you see this in parent-child relationships. If there's a family and they have multiple heirs, they have different promises for each heir, but that promise, that's their inheritance. So when God has set you a vision or given you a promise, that's your inheritance, which means you have access to that. They want you to have that. And so knowing that it's not something you earn, it's not something you have to do, and you're not subject to what Paul calls the elementary principles, that is just yours. And I think about the story of the prodigal son, and we're familiar with the son who leaves and he kind of squanders his money and he comes back and his dad has a big party for him. And then there's the other son who stayed there, who worked hard for his father. And he's wondering, my brother did all this stuff, but he has a party. You're giving him a party. And in that, the father says, you have been with me and everything that I have is yours. And so it's almost everything that God has said for you is yours. And knowing that's part of your identity. If he said this is for you, it's for you. And being able to take hold of that and understanding that that is your part of your inheritance. The next thing is limiting beliefs. So limiting beliefs are thought or assumptions you hold about yourself, others, or the world that restrict actions and limit your potential, often stemming from past expectation or negative self-talks. And I believe a good example of this is in 1 Samuel chapter 9. I believe I talked about it in other videos. But in that, we see where Samuel was telling Saul that he was the answer to Israel's prayers and that he would be the next king. And Saul is like me. I'm from the smallest tribe of Israel, right? I'm going to be king. I'm from the smallest tribe. And it's almost like because he was seeing himself from the smallest tribe, he was seeing himself as small. And we see throughout the process, Samuel is trying to encourage him. He's telling you, well, this is how you know you're going to go to the prophets and you're going to prophesy. And then when it came time to present Saul in front of the people of Israel, Saul hid. And then Samuel had to give some more encouraging words. And we see as we fast forward, Saul becomes king, but Saul had an inability to be obedient to what God was telling him to do. And in that, there came a point where Samuel tells Saul, you were small in your eyes. You didn't see how God was seeing you. God had called you to be king, but you're still thinking you're small. When Samuel asked Saul, well, why did you disobey God? And he said, because he feared people. And so it's one of those things where Saul kept seeing himself from his view and not the view of God. God was saying, you're king, not even just king, the first king of Israel, which is a big deal. And so in that, because of his disobedience, God took him down from king and anointed David as king. And therefore, his whole family lineage was affected. So his sons didn't get to become king. It went to someone else. And so we want to make sure that if we have limiting beliefs, we take them before God and try to get an understanding of where they're limiting beliefs and ask the Lord to help you with them. So next one is doubt, right? So of course, doubt is the opposite belief, which is a very important why you should, one of the steps is to believe. So a good scripture is James 1:6-7. And it says, but let him ask in faith with no doubting. For the one who doubts is like a wave of the sea that is driven and tossed by the wind. I've had personal experience with this where God has told me something, I'm believing in it, he has confirmed it. And I was just being tossed to and fro with anxiety and fear about it. And just, wall to wall tossed. And so one day I was just like, Lord, I don't have peace. Did you really say this? And the Lord said, you don't have peace because of your unbelief. So your unbelief is causing you to be tossed to and fro and have these thoughts and just fear. And we see this with the story of Peter when Jesus called him to step out to him on the water. And Peter started moving, but then he looked at the situation around him and he had fear and he almost started to drown, right? And so in that, when we're in these circumstances, not focusing on what God says, but focusing on God, which scripture tells us he will give us peace beyond all understanding. Because we can mistake us trying to step out and not saying, oh, I don't have peace about it, but it's really you have doubt, which is causing the unsettling, right? So again, we want to focus on God. And the last one is fear. Fear is definitely a big one. Fear of man, fear of failure, fear of even success. These fears can hold you back from even stepping out, from even wanting to believe what God has said. And I think the best scripture in that is what we talked about before, Joshua 1, where God tells Joshua, be strong and courageous. And he tells them this multiple times. There comes a point where you just have to be strong and courageous and step out. So I'm interested to know, have you been thinking big this season, right? We're in April of 2025. And if not, what has been holding you back? And if so, what has been the outcome? So I'm interested if you can put that in the comments. And if you like this video, please like, share, and subscribe. Thank you and have a wonderful day.